Somalians ripped off that state for billions of dollars. Billions. We don't want them in our country. Let them go back to where they came from and fix it.
On January 15th, before most of Cleveland, Ohio awakened, a mechanism that had been extracting billions quietly started to crumble. Throughout 30 months, Ohio's Medicaid allocation surged by nearly 40%, while the population barely shifted and families throughout Cleveland waited 8 to 11 months simply to locate basic childcare. Within the mechanism, thousands of medical procedures were documented every single week. Beyond it, medical facilities were vacant, illumination left activated, examination spaces untouched. Then investigators observed the time records, more than 40,000 patient files generated in the middle of the night, with information so identical it could not represent real people. What transpired led from fabricated medical facilities to international monetary routes, and finally to a dawn enforcement action on January 15th that revealed millions in currency, industrial currency counting equipment, fentanyl concealed inside food assistance, and human beings confined behind locked entrances. This was not merely fraud. This was a welfare mechanism transformed into a weapon. If you care about investigations that reveal what powerful individuals hope you never witness, make sure you subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? And do you think silence protects the vulnerable or protects crime? It commenced with figures that moved too rapidly for any normal mechanism to explain. Throughout a duration of 30 months, the Medicaid allocation of Ohio rose from $8.9 billion to $12.3 billion, an increase of 38%. While the population of the state barely shifted, growing just 3.1% in the same time period. That kind of discrepancy is not expansion. It is a warning indication, like compensating for groceries for a full neighborhood while only a few people reside in the house. In Cleveland, the pressure was observable on the ground. Parents waited 8 to 11 months simply to secure basic childcare. Community medical facilities reported constant staff deficiencies. Nurses were stretched thin. Physicians reduced office hours. And entire sections of medical facilities sat unused for days at a time. Yet within the Medicaid mechanism, the figures told a completely different narrative. Thousands of procedures were documented every single week. Claims kept arriving without pause. Even as real examination spaces remained dark and silent, then a Medicaid auditor observed something impossible to disregard. More than 41,000 patient files were generated between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. night after night, with 87% of the information fields matching almost perfectly, a pattern no human population could ever generate. 3 internal assessments were written, and all 3 vanished. They were marked as politically sensitive and classified as potentially harmful to the community. That was the moment the case moved upward to federal jurisdiction. The FBI, ICE, and the HHS Office of Inspector General started reviewing the information, not with firearms or breaching equipment yet, but with spreadsheets, time records, and silence. At that point, it still appeared like a large fraud, just currency. But ask yourself this, who benefits when billions disappear quietly? And who had the authority to make sure no one was permitted to ask why? As federal analysts tracked the currency upward, every path kept directing to the same identity again and again until it was no longer possible to disregard. Amamira Hassan Noir was 41 years old, a first-term Ohio State Senator, elected just 3 years earlier and widely praised as one of the fastest-rising political figures in the state. To the public, she was a symbol of progress and stability, someone who spoke calmly, smiled often, and promised protection for people who felt unseen by the mechanism. She sponsored 3 major community health bills that expanded Medicaid access, and she championed a low-income housing fund worth $420 million, appearing at ribbon cuttings, town halls, and press conferences throughout Cleveland. In nearly every speech, her message stayed the same: protect the vulnerable, defend marginalized families, and stop discrimination hidden inside audits and oversight. But behind the scenes, the picture appeared very different. According to a sealed federal indictment, Amamira Hassan Noir did not own medical facilities, did not operate non-profits, and did not authorize fraudulent claims. Instead, she provided legal cover for 19 non-profit organizations, intervened when inspectors requested site visits, and quietly redirected scrutiny away from empty buildings and missing staff. Within a confiscated server, investigators located a financial flowchart, and near the center was her identity, shortened, coded, but unmistakable. She did not manage medical facilities. She managed the people who were never permitted to inspect them. What do you think happens when oversight answers to authority instead of truth? The final trigger did not originate from a person, a phone call, or a confession. It originated from a logistics record that did not belong in a charity file. While federal analysts were still tracing Medicaid payments and non-profit links, one shipping invoice connected to North Star Community Health quietly broke the pattern because it listed repeated deliveries of humanitarian rice while carrying a federal transport classification reserved for chemically controlled cargo. The same category utilized for industrial substances that require sealed storage and restricted handling. The weight figures were wrong, the routing fees were wrong, and the safety codes were wrong because rice does not demand chemical containment, and food assistance does not move under hazardous transport regulations unless something else is concealed inside. When investigators traced the delivery routes, every shipment led to the same destination, a warehouse on the edge of Cleveland, sitting within an abandoned industrial corridor roughly 28 minutes from the city center, officially registered as a food distribution hub, yet marked in multiple federal mechanisms for restricted access and limited disclosure. That discrepancy collapsed the entire theory of a simple fraud. At that moment, the investigation crossed from financial review into operational threat, and sealed federal search warrants were authorized throughout multiple locations at once without notification, without delay. At 4:18 a.m., Cleveland was silent. The temperature sat at 18 degrees below 0 Celsius, cold enough to transform breath into ice and make metal brittle, and there were no sirens, no flashing lights, and no warnings. Because speed and silence were now the most important tools, 52 federal agents moved at the same time, divided into 6 coordinated teams, each carrying sealed federal warrants, wearing standard issue body armor, and armed with Glock 17 pistols, M4 carbines, and Remington 870 breaching shotguns assigned to controlled entry units. The first team approached the public service office of the state senator within the administrative district, a building normally filled with staff and community pamphlets, now dark and secured, where agents entered quietly, cleared space after space and secured filing cabinets filled with donor records, legal correspondence, and encrypted storage drives before locating a concealed safe hidden behind a false interior panel. A second team entered North Star Community Health in a low-income neighborhood, a medical facility that billed thousands of procedures each week, where agents located empty examination spaces, unused medical equipment, lights left activated, computers logged in, and claims processing automatically in real time despite the absence of staff or patients. The third team reached the warehouse outside the city limits, where they breached the loading dock entrances and were immediately hit by a sharp chemical odor that did not belong near food. And as they moved within, they discovered a sealed interior section not listed on any building plans, accessible only through reinforced entrances. 2 additional teams entered non-profit satellite offices listed as youth development and job training centers, where desks were neatly arranged but untouched. Printers were warm despite no employees present, and filing mechanisms contained thousands of intake forms that differed only by identity and identification number. The final team entered a small apartment registered as a skills training classroom, and within they located rows of server racks filling every space. 17 machines running non-stop, pushing automated Medicaid claims into state mechanisms hour after hour, controlled by scripts that never slept. As the operation unfolded, evidence started stacking rapidly. Agents seized $11.6 million in currency stored in drawers, safes, and plastic containers alongside 6 industrial-grade currency counting machines worn from constant utilization, equipment no legitimate nonprofit ever needs. That currency was only what could be seized on location, the currency on hand, not the full amount tied to the network. At the warehouse, agents cut open rice bags marked as humanitarian assistance and immediately observed the weight was wrong, because within each bag were vacuum-sealed packages packed tightly, each containing fentanyl powder wrapped for transport enough to supply thousands of street-level doses. The chemical smell intensified as agents documented the scene, secured the area, and photographed serial markings. Because this was no longer a financial crime scene, it was a narcotics operation, hiding behind the language of charity and relief. Every location told the same narrative. Clean fronts, empty spaces, active mechanisms, and currency moving faster than people ever could. By the time the first light appeared on the horizon, investigators understood that what they were observing was not inflated invoices or sloppy oversight, but an organized mechanism designed to extract billions, shield itself from inspection, and move dangerous materials through structures that appeared harmless to anyone who did not look closely. The moment fentanyl appeared within bags of donated food, the case crossed a line that could not be reversed. This was no longer about Medicaid fraud. It was about how a protected mechanism had been permitted to grow powerful enough to hide narcotics, currency, and machines behind locked entrances, while everyone else was told not to ask questions. Ask yourself this: how many people had to look away for this to operate? And how long had silence been mistaken for compassion? Once the enforcement actions exposed what was within the spaces, investigators no longer asked if the mechanism was broken. They started measuring how far it had been bent. Throughout a duration of 30 months, the network siphoned $122.8 billion from Medicaid, an amount equal to roughly 16% of the entire state welfare allocation. Currency that was supposed to compensate for care, housing, and food, but instead vanished through 19 non-profit organizations that existed mostly on paper. The currency did not stay local. Transaction trails showed funds moving through layered accounts, and service contracts routed internationally through financial corridors in Dubai and Nairobi, disguised as consulting fees, technology services, and international assistance coordination. At the ground level, the mechanism rested on three simple pillars. The first was the ghost medical facility and the ghost patient. On paper, certain medical facilities reported 4,200 patient visits every week, but when agents walked those addresses, they located no physicians, no nurses, no patients, and sometimes no staff at all, just secured entrances and silent spaces. Behind those claims was 62,000 stolen identities harvested from vulnerable populations, fed into automated mechanisms that submitted Medicaid invoices between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. hour after hour, night after night. Without human involvement, the second pillar was the algorithm. Investigators isolated a single cluster of false claims that drained $64 million over 18 months, powered by billing software that exploited the absence of mandatory location inspections, a loophole that permitted claims to be compensated first and questioned later, if ever. The mechanism trusted information more than reality, and the software knew it. The third pillar was protection. Whenever auditors raised concerns, the response was immediate and coordinated. Reviews were classified as attacks on the community. Inspectors were accused of bias, and internal warnings were dismissed as politically dangerous. Behind that shield were payments described as advisory fees, ranging from $25,000 to $40,000 per instance, quietly routed through intermediaries to stall audits, redirect staff, and ensure that certain entrances were never opened. Taken together, the design was not complex. It did not require genius. It required permission. The mechanism was not compromised. It was invited in, protected by language, paperwork, and fear of asking the wrong questions. At this stage, investigators understood the truth. This was not random fraud. It was an assembly line built to operate without witnesses. Ask yourself this: when a mechanism rewards silence and punishes scrutiny, how long does it take before crime becomes routine? The true cost of the operation was not counted in spreadsheets or allocations. It was discovered on the warehouse floor within bags that were supposed to feed families who had nothing. When agents finished opening the donated rice sacks, they counted 96 kilograms of fentanyl, sealed tight in vacuum-wrapped bricks hidden beneath layers of grain packed carefully so the weight would not raise suspicion. Yet every package carried lot markings that investigators recognized immediately, codes linked to Mexican cartel distribution routes that had already flooded multiple American cities. This was the moment the case stopped being about fraud and became something far more personal. Within the same facility, agents located 39 people living and working in secured spaces with no windows, forced to handle packaging materials without protection, their passports confiscated, their movement controlled, and their lives reduced to a single number written on paper. Each of them carried the same debt, $45,000. They were told it was a migration fee, a debt they would never finish compensating because refusal meant threats sent back to families internationally, identities, addresses, and warnings that were meant to keep them silent. Internal files recovered from the servers revealed the scale no one outside the mechanism had ever witnessed. More than 1,120 individuals were documented as having entered the country through sponsored programs, enrolled briefly in assistance mechanisms, and then disappeared from official records, absorbed into labor pipelines that were never meant to be visible. As the sun started to rise, the final move was already underway. At 7:06 a.m., federal agents approached a lakefront residence registered under a housing development company, listed as affordable housing, a property far beyond the reach of any public servant's salary. Within, the spaces were quiet, suitcases partially packed, documents stacked neatly, and the operation ended the way it always does, not with speeches, but with handcuffs. Agents seized $53 million in currency and assets traced through shell companies and non-profit fronts and escorted the architect of the mechanism away as neighbors watched in disbelief. In the end, the truth was simple. Welfare was only the cover. People were the commodity. When narratives like this surface, it is tempting to focus only on the scale, the currency, the enforcement actions, the shock value of what was concealed behind secured entrances. But that misses the real lesson, because this case was never just about crime. It was about how easily good intentions can be weaponized when no one is willing to ask uncomfortable questions. This mechanism did not survive because it was invisible. It survived because it wore the language of compassion, because it wrapped itself in charity, and because too many people believed that oversight itself was a form of harm, when in reality, oversight is the only thing that protects the innocent. Every dollar stolen, we can trust. Every fake claim pushed real families further back in line, and every ignored warning taught the mechanism that silence was safer than truth, till silence became the most valuable currency of all. The lesson here is not about politics or borders or ideology. The lesson is simpler. Any mechanism that cannot be questioned will eventually be abused, and any society that treats accountability as cruelty will one day compensate the price in human lives, not just in currency. Real compassion does not fear inspection. Real assistance does not need darkness to operate. And real justice only works when someone is willing to look closely, even when it is uncomfortable. If narratives like this matter to you, if you believe transparency protects people instead of hurting them, then make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because there are more investigations already unfolding and more mechanisms that still rely on silence to survive. And now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what do you think matters more, protecting feelings or protecting the truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because awareness